This is Paul Johnson with New Frontiers. Now, today I have a spirited discussion, let's not call it a debate, with my guest, Dr. Stefan Sommer. Dr. Stefan Sommer has done some amazing work at NAU as a college professor, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this debate deals with climate change, the environment, and on my side, why I think a free market approach is a better way to being able to deal with many of environmental issues, and that the environment, while it may be important, it's no more important than the economy and the well-being of people inside of our society. In any event, Dr. Sommer has been with ASU. He's in the faculty in the Department of Biological Sciences. His areas of expertise include community ecology, sustainability, climate change, and educational outreach. He's made a wide variety of contributions to environmental education and advocacy. On public engagement, Dr. Sommers has delivered literally numerous public presentations on climate change and sustainability, reaching tens of thousands of citizens across Arizona and beyond. His educational initiatives, he's collaborated with over 160 teachers, teaching them methodologies on how to do a better job of teaching environmental issues. He also has been deeply engaged in media productions. He has 4 different award-winning PBS documentaries where he focused on biodiversity and habitat conservation. And he's a community planner. He works very hard inside the community, trying to organize different events around the environment. Now, we have some disagreements, and you'll see those here, but this is a really smart guy who has done a great job of trying to advocate for the cause that he deeply believes in. Now, I'm just an ordinary American who still believes that the United States is a great cause for good. I believe that we can still balance between the needs of our economy as well as the needs that we have in our environment. I also believe that there's quite simply nothing like the United States of America, and I wrote a book about it that's called What's Right with America and How to Keep It That Way. Now, if you like what it is we're talking about on this show, go ahead and press that subscribe button, and let's get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Again, my guest here today is Dr. Stefan Sommer. I'm very proud to have you on our show. You've done a lot of great work in Arizona. I tried to lay out most of that in the introduction. But again, I'd like to thank you for coming on the New Frontiers program.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here and happy to talk about climate change always. It's something I've been doing for a while.
All right, so let's start with that. We'll talk about some areas where there may be potential disagreement in a moment, but if you would, help lay out the problem as you see it, the challenge that we have not only in the climate, give us a helpful definition of what is happening in the climate, but also the challenge that we have in trying to help get that message out.
Well, So in terms of the difficulty of getting the message out, oftentimes is that there is a lot of misinformation out there about climate. As scientists, we've been looking back for 300 million years, as long as the records will take us back, to see how climate varies over time. And we know, to summarize a whole lot of stuff, we know that what's happening now is outside of the bounds of natural variation. So what we're seeing now is not part of the natural variation in climate. We have back in 2020, we had already put about 2,400 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And we know that we will reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming once we've put 2,900 gigatons into the atmosphere. And we're well on our way there. At 59 gigatons of emissions per year, back in 2018, when we first put the Flagstaff Climate Action and Adaptation Plan together, we scientists were projecting that we would reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming sometime in the year 2040. Now, it looks like we will reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming sometime in the year 2028. So climate change has been affected by our emissions, and we now know since about 2018 it has really accelerated. So what was already warming for over 100 years has now reached a much more rapid rate of rise. Um, we we look at things like the ocean temperature. So far, of all the excess heat that the greenhouse gases have trapped in, since we've increased the concentration of greenhouse gases, that 90% of that excess heat has been absorbed by the oceans. So we've got this huge buffering capacity provided by the oceans. The most recent big worry is that in 2023, the ocean surface temperatures, and this is average global ocean surface temperature, took a leap. So there was open space between the warmth of the sea surface temperature in 2023 and the next warmest year. Usually what you see from year to year is this, there's a wobble and there's a slight increase, slight increase, slight increase. But in 2023, there was open space. That open space continued through 2024. And so it suggests that perhaps the oceans have reached their limit on that buffering capacity for temperature. We've now raised the temperature of the oceans down to a depth of about 2,000 meters. And so it's certainly possible that we are reaching the limit on that buffering capacity. If that's the case, and we're already seeing it, we're already seeing a faster raise in land surface temperatures and atmospheric temperatures. And if that is really what it is that it's the oceans have reached their limit, then we should see much more rapid rises in land surface and atmospheric temperatures. So that's really the worry, is that we are starting to reach some of those, what some people refer to as tipping points. I hate to really get into tipping points because we don't know exactly where they are. We don't know exactly how it's going to change then. But in terms of this thing with the ocean, we are already seeing that sea surface temperatures have just taken a leap, and rise in atmospheric temperatures are also increasing. So we're now at about 1.4 degrees centigrade warming, and we expect to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming in 2028 sometime. The problem with that, we don't want to reach those those numbers because if you look at the projections for what the costs of climate change related climate disasters will be, and we're already seeing about right now, we are seeing an average annual crop loss due to climate disasters of about $163 billion per year, which, and depends on how you look at it, that seems like a big number to me. I think it is already affecting our food prices at the grocery store. There are costs of wildfires and costs of increasing frequency and intensity of hurricanes, floods, droughts. All of these things are the result of this rapid change in the Earth's average temperature due to our emissions. If we reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, the projections are that we should see about $36 trillion in annual costs from climate disasters. And given that the global gross domestic product is about $110 trillion, we can't fit $36 trillion worth of damages into our global budget. It just doesn't fit. And we're already seeing where the stresses and strains of those costs are affecting us in big ways. In Central America, there's an area called the Northern Triangle, and it's primarily in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. They have been hammered by harder and harder droughts. And in the low elevations, what that means is that the farmers can no longer really support their farms with enough production of corn, beans, and melons, the way they traditionally did. In the mid elevations where they grow coffee, The seasonality of rainfall has changed, and whole new coffee diseases are starting to hammer their productivity in the mid-elevation of those three countries. So a lot of those folks, it's primarily the farm workers, the folks who distribute food, process food. Um, they're out of luck. They're out of work. The farmers themselves own a little bit of land, so they've got some economic resilience, but the farm workers got no resilience whatsoever. They flee to the cities searching for work, can't find work there, and they ultimately flee northward. And the largest portion of the folks showing up at our southern border here in Arizona are from those three countries. And it's primarily climate change driven. So really, we think of these folks sometimes as, they're coming to our country to take advantage of our economic benefits. Really, they are climate refugees. They didn't leave their homes lightly. It's a difficult decision to pick up and flee your home, but they've come to that conclusion because of the effects of climate change. That sort of thing has been going on globally now for some time, and it will continue to accelerate as the warming of the earth accelerates.
My guess is most Americans are starting to become more aware of this because of rising home insurance rates. The fact that we have, I know that the oceans, when you talk about absorbing that heat, that's really absorbing energy. And as that energy is absorbed and those hurricanes move through it, they seem to be picking up speed much faster than they did in the past. And that's causing problems for places like Florida and Louisiana. In California, we're seeing it different in terms of fires, maybe Arizona in terms of fires. I have a home up in Montana. There we've seen it through the melting of glaciers that happen very quickly, and that creates flooding problems downstreams. All of those have an effect on insurance policies. And, while I believe that we should put more of a focus on believing people and trying to listen to people who are in sciences, I think that we should be more science-based. The one science that I'm 100% sure of are the actuarials who work for insurance companies. Yes. They see that there's a change that's happening. Any comments or thoughts on that?
And you're hitting the nail on the head right there. Back in the 1970s, already the agricultural insurance agencies were changing their actuarial tables because they knew there would be more crop loss related to droughts and floods and what have you. So now in Florida, some of the companies actually they're all raising their rates to cover the added costs of these more frequent and more intense disasters. But some of them are actually closing up shop. This is affecting us in Flagstaff already. I had a neighbor here in my University Heights neighborhood who had his rates for home insurance doubled this past fall. And then in January, they told him they would cancel his policy in March. And that has happened. He was able to find a different carrier. So, it's the entire industry is not done. But we had an insurance professional who was the risk management end of things for insurance tell us that in the past, home insurance companies have been able to balance those costs by having coverage over a large geographic area. And they could then take some of the risk and costs from one location and spread it across a larger group. Problem is now these storms are bigger and more frequent. And so they can no longer spread the costs the way they once did. And that's changing some of the fundamental ways in which they calculate their actuarial tables. So all of these things are changing for the insurance industry, but you're right. The insurance industry, they're the part of the business world that's most on top of all of this climate stuff.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the solutions. And in our pre-call, when we had a discussion on this, I enjoyed that call, by the way, quite a bit. We had some disagreements, specifically with me being kind of more of a pro-market person, and you having some concerns about growth. But why don't we use this? We'll talk about our difference here in a second on that issue. But why don't you start with helping us understand what you think the answers are, and how do you see growth and the free market playing into that?
Well, so I think we particularly here in Arizona, we've got huge opportunities for growth with solar. We have more of a solar resource than any competitor anywhere in this half of the globe. Um, and we should be taking more advantage of it. We have been putting in some good solar and wind power. So, for instance, for us here in northern Arizona, we have 127 megawatts of wind production capabilities at Dry Lake Hills, 99 megawatts of wind at Perrin Ranch. We are getting, as we speak, Babbitt Ranches is putting in 241 megawatts of wind and solar just north of the peaks. And Chevelon Butte is putting in 454 megawatts. And starting next year, Babbitt Ranch's Cobar Solar Project will put in an additional 480 megawatts of solar. So that gives us
Maybe help put that in perspective just a little bit. I mean, one of the numbers that I saw the other day that was interesting, I had to reread it just to see if it was correct. It said that right now, wind and solar in the United States make up about 10% of our energy production. And anything that you can do to help shed light on where we are in Arizona on that, I think might be helpful as well.
So I don't know where we are overall in Arizona on that. But for us regionally here, we've got 1.4 gigawatts now of wind and solar capacity, generating capacity. Globally, we have about 1.1 terawatts worth of wind power and 2.1 terawatts worth of solar generating capacity globally. Now, that sounds big, right? But
Mm-hmm.
our global consumption is at 29,471 terawatts. So we have a huge gap to fill. And Arizona should be filling that gap because we've got the resource. We have absolute advantage in terms of amount of resource for solar, and we should be building it as rapidly as possible. Unfortunately, some of that is currently, well, it was stimulated when we passed the clean energy investments of 2022. But as those get cut back, that's going to slow some of that major expansion in terms of batteries, electric vehicles, clean technology, grid transmission, hydrogen, and solar here in the state of Arizona. We should be taking full advantage of those things, and we should be voting in favor of the stimulus package that was there for helping us develop those things as rapidly as possible. So, yeah, I think there's a huge potential for growth. I think that China positioned themselves well. So back in 2015, there was the Paris Climate Accord, and most countries across the globe agreed to move rapidly to renewable energy. At that time, China positioned itself to supply the world with wind and solar generating capacity. And so they are benefiting from that. We in the United States did the opposite. We should be at the cutting edge of things rather than behind. And so I agree with you in terms of the huge growth potential. That specifically would help us here in Arizona, and we should be taking more complete advantage of it. So there are many companies, as I mentioned, that are currently installing wind and solar here in Arizona, and that's a very good thing. But we should be doing so much more than we are.
All right, so I have some slides on this. I think they might be just helpful to look at them for a second. But I'm going to start with this fundamental belief, and that is I believe that the single most important thing to curing the environment is having a strong economy. I think the two things are connected. One of the stories that I told you about when we were on the phone was in the 1990s. I had an opportunity with the State Department. They sent me on a gig where my job was to try to help local governments who were just coming out from underneath the blanket of the Soviet Union to help them establish themselves and to talk about how they might work in a free society. What was fascinating to me was the single biggest question they had was, where do you put the barber shop and where do you put the the coffee shop and where should you, I mean, they had these beautiful buildings that were built in the 14th century, but literally no work had gone into them for the 100 years that they were underneath the communist control. So I asked them to take me out and look at some of their infrastructure. We went out to the water treatment plant that was a river flowing into the Baltic. It had a grate on 8 inches on center with a guy with a pitchfork pulling out the solids. The rest of the sewage just flowed into the Baltic, and it was so polluted you couldn't swim in it, fish in it. You didn't even want to stand next to it. It smelled so bad. In Krakow, they'd built a variety of industrial plants, and they had all these smokestacks. You couldn't see the tops of the stacks because there was so much smoke coming out of the tops of them. And they created an acid rain that kind of burnt out the forest. When there was this period of time where we started saying acid rain really didn't exist and it was kind of a hoax. I can tell you, and looking at those forests, it wasn't a hoax. You could see that it had just literally burnt them out when the rain took this soot down on top of them. Well, when you went to why, what happened, the answer was dialectic materialism, communism, froze the economy in place. They didn't have any incentive for people to be able to produce, to be able to create goods, to be able to trade. The reason the buildings didn't get restored is because there was no ownership of the buildings. The buildings were communally owned, and they were more concerned about the tenant than they were about the person who was going to invest in the building. And so they didn't have the money to pay for the sewer treatment plant. They didn't have the money to pay for the scrubbers on tops of the stacks. The economy had been extremely damaged. I left with this belief that capitalism isn't the problem for the environment. It's its only solution. When you start to see what people will actually do inside of a society when capitalism breaks down, when there are no incentives to invest, there are no incentives for capital to come in, the problem is dramatically bigger than the problem that comes with capital. Your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think those observations are key to understanding how these differing systems have the potential to work. And I think that within our current system, things work better than that, certainly. But it also depends on the details. So if you look at China, they are not only investing in wind and solar, and they're a communist system, but they are building coal power plants as well. So they're investing in all forms of energy, and it seems to be working for them so far. If you go back to that time period you were talking about, and you look in the United States, we had the results of what the free market had done for us back in the 60s, let's say. And we had rivers that were so polluted that they were catching on fire. The Susquehanna River in Ohio, for instance. We then passed what has been in place for a long time, the Clean Water Act, and that helped us to clean up our waters. And as you're saying, probably we could do that because we had a strong economy, so we had a little bit of buffer economically so that we could put it into cleaning up our sewage treatment systems and all those things that go into getting clean water. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm saying that the free market by itself didn't do that. It was the Clean Water Act that regulated the free market so that things could get cleaner. So I think one system or the other doesn't necessarily just by itself solve the problem. But I think a regulated free market is probably the way to go.
All right, so I'm going to come back to that example because I think that's a very good example in terms of what happened with cleaning up the rivers, for that matter, cleaning up the air. And what I want to talk about on that particular piece is the challenge that global warming has, or global climate change has, in comparison to those, because those were so local. There was a huge amount of push or pushback from private citizens. But before we do that, before we get into that, let me start with a few slides, because a moment ago, you also talked about the United States and China. So these slides are appropriate for that discussion. So if we can, go ahead and put up the first slide. So you pointed out the differential in use between the United States and China. This map shows energy use in terawatts, or electric generation in terawatts, of the United States versus China. And you can see that the United States has stayed basically stable. The United States is planning on basically somewhere near about a doubling of this number. Now, there are reasons why we don't need to produce the same amount of terawatts as China, and some of those are fairly obvious. So the first reason is that China has about 4 times the population. Obviously, they're going to need more energy consumption or more energy being produced because they just quite simply have a much bigger population than the United States. Second, our service economy, we use less energy per dollar of GDP. Now, this may change, but even with the industrialization policy that may come from tariffs, it's not going to change significantly. The United States still is, if you look at since the 1990s, we lost somewhere around $4 billion worth of industrial usage, but we gained somewhere around $80 billion in our service economy. In addition, U.S. products are more efficient. The U.S. products that are more efficient include our building uses, our insulation on our buildings. Everything that we do pretty much is more energy efficient than they are. And we don't build ghost cities. China, if you look at the way that they approach the economy, it's more of a state-managed type of economy. So they go out and they build ghost cities, and then they build plant that quite simply isn't efficient. It's not being utilized. In the United States, there's a much closer relationship between the free market and the actual uses. Now, why the U.S. needs to be competitive on energy in terawatt hours is energy capacity equals economic capacity plus geopolitical power. The point here is that if we want to go out and attract economic growth into our communities, if we want to be able to grow the way that most of us would like to grow, energy capacity is absolutely essential. We also see the electrification of almost everything. The single biggest one that we're seeing right now is what's going on with electric vehicles and autonomous driving vehicles. All of that's being electrified, but it's not just that. It's the air conditioning and heaters that we have in our home. Everything is moving to being electrified. It's also important from a national security standpoint. That includes things that range from cyber attacks all the way to fueling our military. But this is the one that matters the most to me, and it's the one that we utilize, that we talk a lot about on New Frontiers, and that is a foundation for abundance. We are moving towards a society where we're going to move away from a scarcity type mindset. We are in effectively a post-scarcity world. That includes things like AI, food production, desalinization, which is certainly important from an Arizona standpoint, and extending human life. Now, on this next slide that I'm going to show you, you can begin to see the relationship that exists. Today, we have somewhere near 18 terawatts of information that's being utilized in our current usage. But if you look at this, you start to see that if we really fully utilize desalinization, which again, from Arizona's standpoint, is going to be very important to be able to deal with the water issues that we have. It's one of the potential solutions. That could add a terawatt. What we have going on in biotech and longevity, that could add about another 2 terawatts. AI and animation. Now, this is depending upon how much we do in AI. It's actually a fairly conservative number. And then finally, we have the electrification transition, which is about 7.5 terawatts, and others. Point is, it can easily become a 2x type of need. And in fact, most people, depending upon what we do with AI technology, are predicting that it could be anywhere from 2 to a 4x type need in increasing our energy usage. But massive energy abundance could reindustrialize America, lower inflation, and improve our quality of life. It's the single most important thing that we have if we're going to get rid of scarcity and move towards abundance. Here's the point that I'm trying to make on these slides. We have a tremendous amount of utilization that's necessary. Now, if you're following the House bill that just passed, in the wee hours of the morning when it actually took place, they pulled out all the credits that would go towards energy usage. Now, I'm a big supporter of nuclear. I'll ask the doctor the question about that in a moment. But you need these transfer credits to keep the existing production in place if all of those things are important. It is really critical to the United States that we not fall behind, not just on renewable energies, but all energies. And these transfer credits, the number that we're hearing is that about 86% of all energy production that's taking place today is in one way or connected to these transfer credits and the ability to store them. Doctor, any comments on this, Stefan?
You mentioned several things in terms of my brain is saying jump into the nuclear thing, but yes, we need more energy. I fully agree with that. It needs to be electric, however, to be clean so that we do not incur these huge costs that are coming our way and all the human suffering and so forth that goes along with climate change. So we do need to do it in terms of electric energy, and we need to do it more rapidly than we currently are. So, right now, wind is the most competitive way to generate electricity by a good bit. It costs, and these are the Lazard levelized costs, $42 per kilowatt hour generated. Solar is at $46 per kilowatt hour. Coal is at $74 per kilowatt hour, and gas is at $92. Nuclear does not fare well in this comparison because it's at $225 per kilowatt hour. So it's by far the most expensive way to generate electricity. And it has some issues. It doesn't have as much of a emissions footprint in terms of CO2 production. There is some because of the cement and all the transport and so forth that goes with it. But it has other issues in terms of the long-term health costs where we have populations who are doing the mining who are exposed to radiation. We have the problem of the wastes, which we need to store for tens of thousands of years. We consider our country to be to have been around for a while. We have celebrated our bicentennial. We have no idea how to calculate the cost of storing something safely for 1,000 years, let alone 10,000 or 100,000. I don't know how we could possibly really commit to keeping those wastes secure for that long. France is doing this in a bigger way than anybody else on Earth, and they are vitrifying. That is, they're putting a lot of their wastes into glass blocks. And that's probably better than what we're proposing to do, which is to put our wastes in drums and store them in salt caverns like Carlsbad or in old volcanoes. So there are difficulties with not only the mining and the human health effects and the wastes and their long-term costs. So yeah, I think we need to go as clean as possible. And right now, the economics are in favor of wind and solar by a good ways. They are much less expensive.
All right. So I don't have any disagreement that wind and solar today have the best availability from a standpoint of being able to generate electricity utilizing current technology. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give just a little bit of defense to nuclear. While I will admit nuclear has some challenges, meaning even if we decided today to do the mini plants that we're talking about doing, even if we change the types of technologies that don't have as much waste that are associated with them, or the salt compaction as opposed to utilizing fresh water or water as a means to try to cool them, all those changes mean that we have to come up with the transportation system. We have to be able to move the uranium. We have to be able to find the places to mine them, which aren't in the United States today. There are challenges. It's a 10-year solution. It's not a 1-year solution. Now, my own personal opinion is it is the cleanest and long-term has the best potential to be able to affordably provide people with the best energy use, but not right this moment. It will take us time to develop out that infrastructure to be able to make that work. The real question I have is that while we're developing both solar as well as wind, there's a lot of discussion about taking out our old coal-fired units. And from my standpoint, that seems to me like we're digging a deeper hole, that we're creating a bigger problem from an energy use standpoint. And there does seem to me to be a balance here that we have to figure out. One is, how do you make certain that you produce a better environment so that we try to reduce the challenges that come with global climate change. But on the other hand, we also have to deal with the economy and making certain that people's standard of living are kept up, or we're not going to have the money to be able to pay for those things. So tell me how you balance that out when you get done looking at this.
Well, so again, I think we need to look at those costs of climate change and the way in which they are going to change in the near future. They're already in the hundreds of billions of dollars just for the United States alone. But if we go to $36 trillion in climate damages, that will undermine global economy and the United States economy at the same time. So when we were dealing with the clean water thing and rivers like the Susquehanna catching on fire, you're right, those were very small, localized things. The problem with global climate change is that climate affects everything. Agriculture, infrastructure, human health, everything we do is affected by climate change. And we're talking about changes now that we cannot afford, that would undermine our entire economy. So we do need to prioritize things with that future in mind, because the future is not that far off. 2028 is just a couple of years away.
All right. So when you think about this issue in terms of the challenge that we have, let's go back to that question that we asked a moment ago. If, as you start to think about you spoke about clean water issues, clean air issues. In being mayor at those times, there was a tremendous amount of support for the Clean Air Act as well as the Clean Water Act. It was very popular. People are very concerned about whether or not you're putting any type of cyanide inside of their water system, whether or not there's lead in it. I mean, all of the different chemicals that may end up in the water supply, you end up with a broad amount of support. In fact, I would argue sometimes it's overreactive, meaning you get down to how many parts per billion you can actually survive with. And from the public standpoint, oftentimes they look at it as their tolerance is zero. Well, there's no way you can afford to get to zero. It's not there. In fact, even the technology isn't there usually to be able to make it work. But the point I'm making is cleaning up those rivers, I'll bet you that there were lots of citizens in those areas saying, this needs to happen. How do you deal with the political issues that exist around climate change when I don't think you have the same political constituencies that those groups would have had? I might be wrong. Maybe you're seeing something different than I see. But I just don't see the same ground support that the air quality and water quality had in terms of pollution with climate change issues.
I think you're right. And there's a couple of problems. I think in the United States, we have a resilience. We have a large infrastructure. And so we're not as immediately and directly affected by a drought or a flood or so forth, the way people in third world countries are, where they don't have that infrastructure and resilience. That said, though, we need to, just like in Texas, remember the polar vortex thing of 4 or 5 years ago, where suddenly it was very, very cold because we had destabilized the jet stream to the point where they were experiencing colder temperatures, and the infrastructure of their grid was not sufficient to deal with those cold temperatures. Now, what happened there was that actually the fossil fuel generating stations failed to work and the grid failed to work. It wasn't, as some political pundits said, it was not that the wind turbines failed or that the photovoltaic panel generating stations failed. So we've got to keep in mind these long-term things and the changing range of variation of climate. If the utilities in Texas, in developing their grid, had spent a little bit more money on higher quality components to the grid, they would have been able to deal with that climate variation. But they were not looking far enough ahead. They were looking at the immediate, okay, it's cheaper to go with this than that. And they paid their public paid the price for that when the polar vortex suddenly dipped that far south. So we've got to keep these things, as we're planning for the future, we've got to keep those things in mind so that we build our infrastructure sufficiently. All over the United States now, including Flagstaff, communities are having to rebuild their infrastructure because the drainage capacity isn't enough to handle the new storms. Our monsoon intensity has increased in Arizona, and 3 years ago, we had both a 200-year and a 400-year storm monsoon downpour that was so intense we were floating cars down the streets in little old Flagstaff. So all of these things, we need to, in our business models and in our projections for the future, include those climate change effects that we need to plan for. I don't know. I think I've got a little bit away from the question, but anyway, those are the things that come to mind.
And I think the question, the goal of the question was, there's a disconnect that I think that exists that makes it much more difficult to be successful at being able to deal with climate change, simply because it's not as politically connected to the average everyday person's use. Now, maybe when people begin to see the effects of this on their homeowners insurance, that begins to create more of a political change. We'll see if that happens. Help me on this, back on this nuclear question, on some of the new technologies like thorium, as well as stable salt reactors, or even the fast neutron reactors. There are a variety of technologies that seem to be promising, but yet the environmental community seems to negatively react to them almost constantly. What do you think is really driving that division? I mean, a moment ago, you utilized numbers. I've seen a different set of numbers. I'm not going to go through them and get into a debate about what the actual costs are, but there seems to be a lot of support by especially tech companies who are now starting to talk about utilizing nuclear as a means to be able to cover their facilities because they see it as being more affordable. And yet the environmental community constantly seems to have a concern with it. And this just seems to be one of the more obvious areas where a compromise could be reached between the two to accomplish the goals of what the environmentalists want, but at the same time servicing the needs of what the industrialist needs to be able to make certain that we can develop out the economy that I think most of us see as being important.
So I keep going back and forth between your different questions, and my brain can't focus on one. Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. So for the nuclear, I think we have a public that is concerned about the nuclear, in part because of the history. So we have a history of mining all over the Four Corners region and parts of the Southwest, where the mine tailings are still there. The wind blows them. We breathe them. People are concerned about this. So we have ongoing public concern about those kinds of issues. We've got ongoing concern about the wastes and things that I was mentioning earlier. Fukushima, so we have promises that the technology is getting better, and then something like Fukushima happens, and now that little plot of the earth is no longer livable. And people have those kinds of concerns because they're big and they're long term and they affect them, at least psychologically. People in Fukushima were affected directly. People here see that and they worry, oh, is that going to happen here? So I think that's part of the public perception problem. Earlier you were asking me about the public perception relative to environmental concerns being different now than they were back when we were doing things like passing the Clean Water Act. And I think that specifically with regard to climate change, there's a big difference. And part of it is that we scientists have not been effective enough in helping the public understand what's happening with climate change and the consequences of what's happening with climate change. But also because just like back in the days of cigarettes and tobacco, there was an industry of misinformation about the health effects of cigarettes and tobacco, just as now there is a campaign of misinformation about climate change. So there's a book called Merchants of Doubt that lays out how the folks who were working for the tobacco industry back then actually changed positions and became the voice for the fossil fuel industry. So scientists, we have not been very effective, but also we're dealing with a major misinformation campaign against the scientific understanding. So it's gotten more difficult, and the public is less certain about the issues of climate change, in part because they've been misinformed.
So you laid out a pretty aggressive year in terms of trying to get to what sounds like a massive decarbonization or maybe a net zero mandate. I'm kind of assuming that that's where you think that we should be going. Do you really think there's any way of being able to get to that without things like nuclear or carbon capture or natural gas? I mean, aren't those really an essential part of being able to fill that need until we actually can get to alternatives?
Well, I think what you're saying is we need a way to transition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think absolutely, of course, you're right. But to me, when we decide not to decommission a coal plant, that slows the transition, and we need to very rapidly speed the transition. So we need to be doing what next era and next gen companies are doing, and installing as much solar and wind and clean energy technology as rapidly as we possibly can. So, yeah, no, if I go, there's one way I could go that would take us off topic again. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
So for instance, we need to be speeding up the move to electrifying our economy and electrifying it with clean electricity. And so when Congress is trying to pull back the Clean Energy Investment Act of 2022, for Arizona alone, that would mean we would lose $3.61 billion in investments. We would lose 10,635 jobs as a result of that act of Congress. Our U.S. representatives should be doing a better job for us and advocating for the kinds of things we need to grow our economy here in Arizona. They've lost touch, and in part it's because of that misinformation campaign, and their constituents aren't really even sure that climate change is happening. So that misinformation campaign cascades through the whole system, and it affects the legislation, which underlyingly affects our ability to grow. So repealing the tax credits, which are now under threat in Congress, that would cost Arizona specifically $13.34 billion in investments and over 13,500 jobs. So that misinformation campaign is a serious cost to our economy in Arizona.
Yeah, and again, from my standpoint, if you want to build out a new economy, the economy of abundance, we just simply have to look at energy usage. And again, I could see there as being a difference in my position and yours in terms of how quickly we should phase out coal, but there's zero argument that we need more of this and that these tax credits are absolutely necessary to being able to make that work. So let me give you a challenge that I have on environmental issues, and maybe you can help me with this. This is about whether or not energy policy should have to pass some type of human benefit relationship in terms of cost. So during the time I was mayor, let's go back to that clean water issue. The city of Phoenix ended up being sued, and I remember EPA came to us and they wanted us to build a plant that would clean up alums out of the water. Now, I will be honest with you, I'm not a scientist. I didn't know a damn thing about alums. I had to go learn what alums were. But as it turns out, we take our water supply, and up at the very top of the river, we'll put alums into the water. And those alums work as a coagulant in the water. They take out all the big solid pieces in these ponds that are way up high in the river, in the water supply system. And then the remainder of the water comes down our canals, and they're cleaned up through reverse osmosis at the back portion. Well, in the event of a 1,000-year flood, which with what's going on in your industry with climate change, that may now be a 100-year flood. That's what we're seeing in at least some areas. But nonetheless, a 1,000-year flood could wash these alums out, and then we would have to let them go past our water treatment plant, and they would have ended up in what was called the Rio Verde, where we had created an ecosystem. When I say we had created, the reason I say that is because it was through the damming up of the rivers that created these ponds. If you didn't have it, it would just kind of flood out and then stop, then flood out and then stop. There wouldn't have been a solid flowing river. Not, people in Ohio might have a solid flowing river, but if you know the Salt River, that's just not the way it works here. But nonetheless, there were flathead minnows in that water, little teeny tiny fish that would have been affected by it. So when I got done with it, I said, okay, so I'm in the middle of a recession. You want me to spend $80 million, which somebody told me today the cost would be about $500 million. But at that time, it was $80 million to build this plant. And my answer was no. Now, EPA basically said to me, if you don't do it, we'll put you in jail. And my answer was, oh, that'll be interesting. I want to see this. I want to see how this actually works. I'm willing to play this one out. And as it turns out, they backed off. My point is, there were a lot more important things to do with that money, even environmentally. It just didn't make sense. And I think sometimes part of what happens on environmental issues with scientists is that we're not really applying any cost benefit to the measures that we're implementing. And we're not taking into account the economy and other issues at the same time. My question is, have you seen any process where they do that better? Or is this always kind of a hit and miss, where you have a group of scientists who are making a claim and then another bureaucrat who tells you what the answer is, and at the end of the day, we're not really quite sure if this is the best way that we should move to try to help us deal with global climate change, or if there's another way that would have been more cost efficient? How do you balance that out? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. But you're absolutely right that we need to be doing that kind of cost-benefit analysis that takes into consideration people's livelihoods, and there are various competing pressures on those. So, how you would make that decision in the best balanced way, it would be a challenge, I think. And the way we've gotten where we are is that a lot of time industry is saying, well, it's cheaper for us to allow this pollutant into the environment. And then on the other hand, the EPA or whichever government regulator is looking at this and saying, yeah, but it has cascading effects through this environment and through this human health issue and through this agricultural productivity issue or whatever. So if we could find a bridge of trust between the groups so that we had a way to communicate with each other where we could hear each other and really have a chance of getting to the best possible outcome, just as in the Fossil Creek story. I think if we could find a way to have a conversation that includes all of those considerations, we're more likely to be able to come out with the right answer.
So on this issue of how oftentimes, I feel like oftentimes we get this group of elites that are trying to make these choices. They're doing it from a top-down approach. It often ends up being in Washington, D.C., where those decisions are being made. What I like about what you're doing is that you seem to be more focused on local governments and on local change. And a moment ago, we spoke about the importance of how you have a constituency on rivers and on lakes and on air pollution because people were directly affected by it. What brought you to the point of focusing on local governments as opposed to focusing on national policy and teachers for that matter?
Well, and the population as a whole, because there is this misinformation campaign that reaches a huge portion of our population. And I sort of realized that people were not getting the scientific understanding. So really my efforts have been focused on public education, and where I can do that most effectively is locally, where in-person presentations are always better. My group also does global presentations through Zoom. And those are effective in a different way, but I think really having a sense of community with a speaker present who you can ask questions of, it just makes much more sense from my perspective. So that's why I've gotten into the kinds of education outreach that I have. And we have been locally working with the city of Flagstaff, and that's primarily because they're making decisions that affect us directly right here. There are other groups that work at the national level, and they're focused on pushing Congress to do this or that, but we don't have that capacity, nor is it as meaningful to me personally.
So with teachers and helping them try to do a better job of instruction on this in the classroom, what's the focus on that? What do you try to focus on for them to try and help make that change?
Well, so for a few years, I was working in a program that was to help elementary school teachers teach science. And we were focused basically on helping them understand the science so that they could effectively communicate it in the classroom. And, they developed lesson plans that were science-based and how to get this or that scientific concept across. So in that case, we were starting from the ground up. We weren't necessarily pushing environmental issues per se, just understand the science and help the kids understand the science so that they can become better evidence-based critical thinkers, in essence. And we need to do that for the whole population, I think. Many folks, and for all of us, we get caught by the emotional thing of the moment rather than the underlying data. And we all need to become more evidence-based in our reasoning and in our decision-making. And so that's a lot of the focus of what I do in my own educational efforts, is help people understand the evidence so that the reason we think this is because the data say this.
So one of my challenges that I see with the environmental issues are that you can never get to a win. I hear from a lot of environmental advocates a fear-mongering, and who knows, maybe they're accurate, but the fear-mongering is one that seems to give zero acceptance about the things that we've done right. There are a lot of things that we've done right on the environment, a lot of things that we fixed. A moment ago, you were talking about the river issue. Now, when you were talking about the lakes that caught on fire, I recall that. I was a very young boy when that took place, but I recalled the stories being in the newspaper. And they're oftentimes utilized to talk about why some regulations are good. But I think the story there is we fixed it. We cleaned them up. Those lakes now, you can live next to them. I'm going to go back to that Baltic in Poland. You couldn't live next to it. You couldn't fish out of it. You didn't even want to stand there because it smelled so bad. We cleaned ours up. We were successful. In fact, on air quality, I don't think you'll ever hear a regulator say the good things that we've done on our air quality. We've made some substantial differences that have been important. And if you don't believe so, go to Taiwan. Take a look at what the air quality looks like. I mean, there, your eyes burn the minute you get into the city because of the amount. I mean, it usually is carbon monoxide, ozone, which is a mixture of hydrocarbons and nitric oxides that mix together, and then the particulate problem. They have all three, and they're so bad, it's just like incredibly obvious in both your senses and what you're seeing. I'm not saying we can't do more, but the question that I'm asking is, there never seems to be a victory for people in the environmental movement. And maybe even more importantly, I don't think they give America credit for how American exceptionalism has worked, how it is that we've actually made a lot of improvements. I don't know, maybe most people are more motivated by telling them how terrible they are. I tend to be more motivated by showing me, giving me a goal, patting me on the back as I go along, and then pointing backwards and saying, hey, take a look at how great a job that we did on this. Now let's take a look at the next goal. In fact, I think that's a key for motivation. Help me on that. Help me understand the environmental movement on that issue, specifically with what you're doing in schools and talking to community leaders.
Well, I don't know if I can really speak for the entire environmental movement, but yeah, we do. Me personally, I definitely celebrate things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and I recognize the value they've had to cleaning up the environment here in the United States. There's no question about it. But it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. So it's not like we passed the Clean Water Act and then everything was fixed. No, we passed the Clean Water Act and now we have to implement, and we continually implement the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act or, whatever. So those protections are not just a one instantaneous thing. It's an ongoing process. But yes, I think overall, if the environmental community were to be asked that question, and everybody would say, yes, we recognize this and this victory, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. We recognize that our businesses here in Arizona are putting in a lot of good, clean wind and solar generating capacity, and that's a victory. And then, but the next sentence is, but it needs to be so much bigger. We need to do so much more.
So how do you deal with helping teachers on this doomsday type prophecies? Again, I get it that it's probably being driven more because of the urgency that they see that exists. But do you focus more on teaching them about the importance and the things that they enjoy in the natural environment, or instead do you spend time with the child trying to tell them about how bad it is and how worrisome it is about the future that they're going to inherit? What's the approach?
Well, so mostly when I'm talking to teachers, we don't really get into those kinds of things. We're talking more about the underlying science, as I was saying. We don't really get into the advocacy issues and that sort of thing. But when we talk about climate change, you can't really talk about climate change without talking about the consequences. I'm careful to not just talk about the consequences, but also talk about the long list of solutions that we have, because we do have a long list of ways to address climate change, and implementing them not only is good for people and feeling about what they're doing, but it's also good for our economy. So those solutions oftentimes are win-win-win. And so when I do talk about the consequences of climate change, when I'm talking to the public or to teachers, I put them right alongside the solutions, because those are win-win outcomes.
And maybe I'll just wrap up with this and give you then the last thoughts. This is what I've learned in politics. Pessimists were really important. They were necessary. Right? They were the people standing over on the side, throwing rocks at us, telling us about all the things that they thought were problems. But it was almost always universal. The people who ended up fixing the problems were the people who believed that we could. It's just the way it worked, right? And the reality is, I think that the doomsday stuff that we preach, I remember when Joe Biden made the comment that what's going on with climate change is worse than a nuclear holocaust. I may be misstating that, and so people can Google it and take a look at it, but that was how it appeared to me. The point I would make is, I don't think that's helping the cause. I think what helps the cause is to point out the great environmental challenges that we faced in the past. And yeah, this one's a bigger problem, but back then we didn't think that there were any bigger problems than those two. There were many, many people who thought, no, those rivers are done. You're not going to be able to clean them up. But there were people who believed that we could, and we worked on it, and we made a difference. And in doing it, we didn't hurt the economy. We overwhelmingly helped the economy. We made it better in those areas. We deserve a pat on the back for that. We deserve to remember the great things that we've done. We've gotten into this stage, and it's being driven by both sides that cause us to believe that this whole thing is falling apart. The people who don't want you to get what you're going to have are giving a doomsday philosophy about how terrible the environmentalists are and how they have such a terrible agenda, and they're just simply telling us things that aren't true. And the people on the environmental side are telling us how bad it is without pointing out increasingly not only where the solutions are, but where places exist where we can build a better coalition. Any event, maybe your last thoughts on this matter.
Well, I think the misinformation campaigns about climate change do sometimes push not scientists so much, but the environmental activists to stating things more extremely, to counter the misinformation that's out there. But I think really your message about the economics of the solutions and that those build our economy and boost our economy is a really key message. And I think I write this monthly column for the Daily Sun, our big newspaper here in northern Arizona. It called Spotlight on Climate. And one of the articles, and I'm the author and editor for other folks who write them. One of them was by Diana Stewart, who is a faculty member here at NAU. And the title of it was Hope Through Action. So in the same way that action, the solutions, boost our economy, they can also boost our emotions, our mental health and well-being. So I think those solutions and pushing those solutions and doing them as quickly as possible, again, win, 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 win.
All right. Well, Dr. Sommers, thank you for all that you're doing. I appreciate the good work. And again, thanks for being on our New Frontiers program.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
All right,
pleasure.
Thank you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.